Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for tuning into Koshur Musalman. It's a Sonsurim podcast. The Patmilet kar is kath about culture, psychology and colonialism. Aaj kar was discuss colonial feminism. Colonial feminism show yel women's rights ya the narrative on women's rights. Ye narrative chi wa appropriate karna to use karna in the service of colonial empire. At the heart of colonial feminism there are two things. There is an assumption, beshak, fantasy. We'll talk about the assumption first and then we would move on to fantasy. Assumption चाहिए कि the men in the colonized societies are terribly oppressive towards women. And the oppression towards women, you see zulm shu against women, one shu yiwa ki shu ak inherent part, ak natural part of the culture and the religion of the colonized people. So essentially what is being said is that it is Islam that makes Kashmiri Muslim men hostile to Kashmiri Muslim women. You see, assumption chu issue use karna in the service of colonialism taaki ak moral to ethical justification ही provide karna to the colonial project of eradicating or attacking the religion and the culture of the colonized people. So is heka vanith ki colonial feminism is the colonization of women's rights, where women's rights are invoked to stigmatize Islam and dehumanize Kashmiri Muslim men, because these Kashmiri Muslim men are viewed by the colonial authority as sites of resistance to its imperial domination. What colonial feminism also does is that it projects the Muslim Kashmiri man as the main oppressor, as the root cause of all the problems and evils that the Muslim Kashmiri women face. And the Muslim Kashmiri women Sushiwan depict karna as the main victim, but as a passive victim, as a victim who needs to be represented because she doesn't know how to represent herself, as a victim who doesn't know what is good for herself, as a victim who needs protection. And you should point yetness colonizer to realize kara to fulfill kara panin savior fantasy, the fantasy that we were talking about in the beginning. This is the point that allows the colonizer to represent itself as the guardian of women's rights, and this is something that Gayatri Spivak brings our attention to. Gayatri Spivak chaswana ke there is a principle, a narrative that is at the heart of imperialist justification or feminist justification of colonialism. So narrative show white men saving brown women from brown men, or we can also say white women saving brown women from brown men. In our case, it is Indian men or Indian women saving Kashmiri Muslim women from Kashmiri Muslim men. Yelis Paranch about French colonization of Algeria. Throughout the colonial era in Algeria, colonial feminism was at the heart of things. In French colonizers is Yimokor istemal the assumed oppression of Algerian Muslim women to deny the Algerian nation its right to liberation. The French colonizers would argue that because Algerian men oppressed their women, tim cha uncivilized. Because timan behavior towards their women, it was conditioned by their religion Islam. So the Algerian Muslim man had to be civilized and disciplined through colonialism. In the 19th century Algeria, varia European photographers Imokar produce eroticized images of Muslim women removing their veils and revealing their bodies. But yim photographs produce karna, circulate karna widely in France, and present karna as a cultural victory over the colonized. You see, the act of an Algerian Muslim woman unveiling or removing her clothes, ye act of present karna as liberating and freeing the Algerian Muslim woman from the oppression of the Algerian Muslim man. Now this colonial feminist enterprise, it's not an entirely male project. Yelis Paranch about Algeria is white middle class women acquired power by being part of this discourse of imperialist feminism. An interesting example is that of the 19th century painter Henrietta Brown. Yossi painter us imbano panas khatra a career out of depicting the lives of Algerian Muslim women. Imker use pun in position as a woman to enter into a world, the world of Algerian Muslim women, to which European Orientalist men had been denied access. Patialim paintings banav, in those paintings, she reflected and reproduced what the colonial world already thought and assumed about Algerian Muslim women. She portrayed them as victims of the cruel patriarchal practice of the Algerian Muslim men, thus appealing to the savior fantasy of the French colonizers. We have modern day Henrietta Browns running around in Kashmir, misal ke taur pe Barkhadat. Byakak principle use fundamental to colonial feminism, such कि all women must define themselves by their gender first, while other identities, misal के तौर पे cultural identity या mazhabi identity या political identity, these identities must come second. Yohe principle छे इस वजह येल वारिया western feminists, तबे Israeli feminists जो portray करा Golda Meir, former Israeli Prime Minister, as a symbol of women empowerment, completely neglecting the fact that Golda Meir is responsible for the killings of so many Palestinians, completely ignoring the fact that she has denied the existence of Palestine. Kashiri mazde shikiyan feminists yim yuhe principle se follow kara yel tim present shikara Nidhi Razdan ya Mehbooba Mufti. Both are apologists of military occupation. They present them as symbols of women empowerment. When we study US invasion of Afghanistan, there were many Western feminists who encouraged the invasion and saw the invasion as a legitimate tool to save Muslim women from the presupposed patriarchy of Afghan men. These Western feminists can also be called Orientalist feminists. These feminists believe that Islam as a religion is inherently misogynistic in nature, which means that oppression against women, according to them, is an inherent part of Islam. In the United States, an alliance came into existence, and this is important for us because there is a similar alliance that exists in India concerning Kashmir. An alliance को create of far-right nationalists, feminists, and neoliberals. These three political actors, belonging to different political ideologies, found a common ground. Human mule a common ground in an imperial desire to what they call emancipating Muslim women. And this peculiar intersection that brought them together is what Sara Farris calls Femonationalism. It is this Femonationalism that caused many Western feminists to celebrate the presence of female soldiers in the United States Army, despite the fact that this army was involved in war crimes. Lila Ahmed, in her book Women and Gender in Islam, tells us that colonialism's use of feminism to promote the culture of the colonizers and to perpetuate cultural imperialism against the natives, to undermine native religion and native culture, has ever since imparted to feminism in non-Western societies, but particularly Muslim societies, the taint of having served as an instrument of colonial domination. Yelis paranche, the historical proximity of feminism to Orientalism and imperialism, ashu samajhuwa why feminism is vulnerable to the charge of being an ally, a historical ally of colonial interests. So I asked Professor Hafsa Kanjwal about colonial feminism and Kashmir and how exactly can a grassroots movement for women's rights exist in Kashmir in the presence of colonial feminism. Let's listen to what she had to say.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. So I want to talk about imperial feminism today, and I'll actually broaden the definition and include both imperial as well as liberal feminists. because they are interlinked, but they're also a bit different in terms of how they operate in Kashmir. So in regards to imperial feminists, so these are women who are part of the colonizing state or structure. In the context of Kashmir, these are Indian women, mostly elite women who are aligned with the Indian state in many ways. And they have internalized Orientalist attitudes towards Muslim women in particular. So in their mind, Muslim women are uniquely oppressed and Muslim men are the worst patriarchs. And that is how they kind of engage with the question of Kashmiri Muslim women in particular. For them, women have no agency. They have no, they're completely helpless. They're victimized. And so in many ways, what the Indian state tries to do through these imperial feminists is create this, Kashmiri woman, this category of Kashmiri women that must be saved by the Indian state. And so, of course, we know that with one of the reasons that was given for the abrogation of Article 370 or the deoperalization of Article 370, it was that Kashmiri women who married non-Kashmiri men could not hold on to their property, and thus we have to save these women from such laws and such patriarchy. So that's kind of and in the case of India, I mean, now many of these women are not even claiming to be secular liberal feminists. I mean, these are Hindutva women, right, who have so many problems when it comes to the Hindutva ideology and how it remakes Indian womanhood, which they're completely blind to. They see that project as actually liberating their own women, and yet they still claim that they stand for feminism or they stand for women's rights in the colonial territory in Kashmir. And but aside from that, there's another category of a feminist, which I would, for our purposes, I'll describe as a liberal feminist. And this is someone who might present herself as being concerned about what is happening in Kashmir, may prove to be sympathetic to the plight of Kashmiri women, the human rights violations, and so on. But one of the things that this kind of feminist does, which again is in many ways part of the state project as well, is that she tries to create this both sides narrative. So saying things like Kashmiri women are stuck between the state and Kashmiri men, or sometimes Kashmiri men just becomes like militants or rebels or so on. And it's this both sides, Kashmiri women being in between one and the other and being repressed by both, that is also very sinister. So while they acknowledge that the state has done things, they love to also say that, the militants are also doing this and they're also, oppressing Kashmiri women. So this must be completely called out. I mean, to know Kashmir is to know that women are on the front lines of giving support to the rebels and supporting the movement. So, there is, if you speak to an actual Kashmiri woman, that is not the kind of framing that she herself would use. So part of this is also that both liberal and imperial feminists refuse to understand or have any sense of women's religious subjectivities. So they seek to create this kind of ideal secular liberal subject, turn people away from identifying with their religion, identifying with their religious beliefs and practices, and the ideal then is to push towards this, universal category of secular womanhood. And that is the assumption that is undergirding a lot of these attitudes and behaviors. And of course, there's no understanding of the broader structures, right? The structure of occupation, the structure of colonization that fundamentally informs the day-to-day of Kashmiri women's lives. And what has been unfortunate in recent years, and this has actually been going on for some time, is that it's not just Indian women who are perpetuating these two kinds of colonial feminisms. Kashmiri women themselves, especially of a certain social class or strata, have also internalized that rhetoric. One of the disturbing things about imperial feminism is not that it just simply seeks to assert its own framing and understanding of the issue, but that it also does not allow for a truly indigenous grassroots women's rights movement, which is important. I mean, I think we can all acknowledge that there is patriarchy that exists in society, including in Muslim societies, as well as all societies. The way that patriarchy looks and is informed, and its causes and its solutions will look different for each society given their own cultural context. However, what imperial feminism also does is that it creates a situation where to even speak of women's rights is to align then with imperial feminism and with the state. And so it really places an undue burden on those women who do speak out about women's rights issues, but may not necessarily align with themselves with the state. But those women are also then posited as imperial subjects or liberal subjects and so on. So I think it is fundamental that a grassroots, indigenous, decolonial women's rights movement exists, one that is actually informed by women, their experiences, their subjectivities, and their understandings of the world around them, rather than kind of imposing certain ideologies or constructs onto women. And that is something that needs to happen. It's going to be very difficult for a women's rights movement to go forward, because certain actors in society, men, for example, will always be on the defensive. It is as it is. It's always difficult to have a conversation about some of these issues because they challenge the norm. They challenge what is the status quo. And people who are in structures of power or authority or benefit from the status quo will always be defensive towards it. But then when you add the imperial gaze, then it causes an even greater backlash, because then it becomes a civilizational discourse between, the West and us, and the West or Christianity or secularism or liberalism is trying to impose and, make us less Muslim and so on, even though we know, and there has been a lot of literature and cases on indigenous Muslim feminisms, if you'll call it that. And many Muslim women don't, because of how loaded that term is. So I think it is really important that that decolonial feminist lens happens, and it can only happen with actually speaking to and speaking with Kashmiri women, and not out them and not at them and not for them. And that's something that takes time. It takes a lot of work, difficult work that has to be done. The other thing that I will also add here is that, the category of woman is in and of itself not a similar category across the board. So whereas imperial and liberal feminists might claim that all women want the same things and they all have the same interests and the same desires and aspirations, that's just simply not the case. Women are not a monolith. To create them as such is really problematic. And we know that there are some women who may ascribe to certain norms that liberal feminist subjects would see as being patriarchal or repressive and so on. But these women are doing it because they find some value in it. Perhaps their priority is not on something that is that what other women might have. So it is also important to acknowledge that women are not just defined by their gender, they're also defined by their class, caste, religion, education, and so on. And so to also, if any kind of decolonial feminist perspective exists, it must take that into consideration as well.
Now, as Professor Hafsa Kanjwal tells us, that there are certain feminists within Kashmir who have internalized Orientalism or who have internalized Islamophobia. Now, Hamid Dabashi, Ishaq author, English a kitab yat naavsh Brown Skin, White Masks. In this book, Hamid Dabashi choiswana कि these native feminists who have internalized Orientalism or who have internalized colonial feminism are in fact native informants. Hamid Dabashi choiswana कि these native informants are a highly representative case of self-hatred or autophobia. Yemen choasa unrivaled hatred for their own birth, their own breeding, their own culture, and their own religion. Hamid Dabashi calls them house Muslims. On the other hand, the colonial authority, when it comes to representing the Kashmiri Muslim society, replaces the sociological expertise with the personal experiences or the personal ideas of these native informants. Beim native informants asa, they do not tell the colonial master what he needs to know, but they tell the colonial master what he wants to hear. In return, vachutui ki Indian liberals ya Indian intellectuals they say to these native informants ki tu issue voices of reason, to issue voices of dissent against the inherent and the dominant barbarity of the Kashmiri Muslim society. I also asked Professor Atharzia about colonial feminism and how she understood it. Let's listen to her.
State feminism chu yem sat niswani hakukan hins muhim yus chhe su chu state hevan panas pet ya ka mulk ya ka government ya chhavan panas pet ta agar es bicho Kashmir maz chu 1970 pethai state feminism chalu gomut yeten hukumata won ki es karo women's empowerment ya niswani hukuk ches muhim chhe so karo es barabar banao es ak hissa تَتھ منٛز یِم تَمہِ ساتہٕ موقعہٕ سیاست دان ٲسۍ ہِندُستانٕکۍ تِمو کوٚر سُہ برابر بنووُکھ سُہ اکھ سیگمنٹ تَمہِ سۭتۍ گٔے زنانن ہٕنٛز ڈیولپمنٹ تہٕ زنانہٕ پچہِ واریاہ برونٛہہ مگر سٹیٹ فیمنزمُک کیاہ چھُ آسان مقصد تَتھ چھُنہٕ مقصد یہِ آسان کہِ سونٛچُن سمجھنُک حق تَتھ منٛز چھُ آسان یِہوے ڈیولپمنٹ تَتھ منٛز چھُ آسان یِہوے پروگرٮ۪س کہِ تُہۍ گٔژھِو مین سٹریٖمَس منٛز تُہۍ بٔنِو ڈاکٹر تُہۍ بٔنِو انجیٖنیر تُہۍ ہیٚکِو باقٕے پروفیشنز اختیار کٔرِتھ یِتھ کٔنۍ زنانو کٔرۍ تہٕ تی چھِ أسۍ وٕچھان 50 منٛز 60 منٛز 70 منٛز 60 منٛز 90 منٛز تی چھُ گژھان مطلب زنان چھےٚ پَکان برونٛہہ برونٛہہ تِم چھِ پَران لیکھان مگر ہُپٲرۍ چھِ سونٛچنہٕ سمجھنہٕ نِش تِم دوٗر گژھان اگر تُہۍ وٕچھِو ییٚمہِ ساتہٕ آزٲدی ہٕنٛز مُہِم یۄس چھےٚ یا تَتھ منٛز لیکھنُک حِصہٕ یُس چھُ تَمیُک سونٛچنُک سمجھنُک حِصہٕ اگر زنانو یوٗتاہ پوٚر تہٕ لیوٗکھ مگر تِمو کوٚر نہٕ تِمو بِچاریو ہیوٚک نہٕ تَتھ منٛز کٔرتھٕے تِکیازِ سُہ اوس نہٕ آلریڈی جُرم آمٕژ بَناونہٕ آزٲدی ہٕنٛز مُہِم پِلبِسایٹٕچ مُہِم سۄ ٲس آمٕژ گۄڈے جُرم بَناونہٕ تہٕ سۭتۍ ٲس زنان آسہٕ پَکان پَرنَس لیکھنَس کُن مگر تِمن اوس نہٕ سُہ حق تہِ کینٛہہ کہِ تِم ہٮ۪کہٕ تَتھ مُتعلِق سوٗنٛچِتھ تہٕ سٹیٹ فیمنِزم چھُ تی کران سٹیٹ فیمنِزم چھُ بَناوان اکھ پروگرٮ۪س سُہ چھُ دِوان تَمیُک موقعہٕ مگر سۭتۍ چھُ سونٛچُن سَمجُن تہِ نِوان تہٕ اِنسان چھُنہٕ ہٮ۪کان پانَس خٲطرٕ سوٗنٛچِتھ سَمجِتھ تہٕ تی چھِ أسۍ وٕنکیٚس وٕچھان تہِ أسۍ چھِ ییٖتۍ سٲری چھِنہ سُہ وَنان پَڑے لِکھے اَندھے تی چھُ اَسہِ کٲشرٮ۪ن گوٚمُت أسۍ چھِ وٕنکیٚس پٔرمٕتۍ لیٖکھمٕتۍ مگر نہ چھِ پَنٕنۍ ہِسٹری پَتہ نہ چھِ پَنٕنۍ ثقافت پَتہ نہ چھِ پَتہ مطلب یِمن چیٖزن ہُنٛد گوٚژھ اَسہِ پَتہ آسُن پوٗرٕ یُس اَسہِ کٔشیٖر چھےٚ کَتٮ۪ن کیاہ چیٖز چھُ اَتھ کیاہ ہِسٹری چھےٚ تہٕ سورُے مطلب یہِ اَسہِ پَتہ گوٚژھ آسُن تہِ چھَنہٕ اَسہِ پَتہٕے وٲلڈ ہِسٹری چھےٚ پوٗرٕ پَتہ مگر کٔشیٖرِ ہِنٛز ہِسٹری چھَنہٕ پَتہٕے ہِندُستانُک جنگہِ آزٲدی چھُ پوٗرٕ پَتہ پَنُن چھَنہٕ پَتہٕے سُے چھُ سُہ کوٚرُکھ مردن منٛز تہِ تہٕ سُہ کوٚرُکھ زنانن منٛز تہِ مگر سٹیٹ فیمنِزم چھُ اکھ واریاہ 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 موٗزی چیٖز اگر فیمنِزم پانے یوت آسہِ سُہ گوٚژھ سونٛچُن تہٕ سَمجُن تہٕ لیکھُن بیٚیہِ سارنٕے یِم تہِ زنانہٕ مرد تہٕ باقٕے جینڈر چھِ تِمن دیُن کُنُے اِکوالٹی دِنۍ تِمن سونٛچنٕچ سَمجھنٕچ سۄ چھےٚ نہٕ سٹیٹ فیمنِزمَس منٛز آسان کینٛہہ سٹیٹ فیمنِزمَس منٛز چھِ تۄہہِ وَنان کہِ أسۍ ہسا کرو تۄہہِ ڈیولَپ تہٕ مگر تُہۍ گٔژھِو ڈیولَپ سانہِ طٔریٖقہٕ تہٕ تی چھِ أسۍ وٕچھان وٕنکیٚس کٔشیٖرِ منٛز گٔژھِو ڈیولَپ سانہِ طٔریٖقہٕ تُہۍ کٔرِو ترقی سانہِ طٔریٖقہٕ تہٕ پگاہ یِتھُے تُہۍ اکھ پُلٹِکل سبجیکٹ ٲسِو سُہ تہِ ٲسِو سونُے تۄہہِ یۄس سیاست آسیو سۄ تہِ آسیو تۄہہِ سٲنی ہِش یہِ تۄہہِ پنٕنہِ خٲطرٕ خواب آسہِ اَکہِ قومُک سُہ تہِ آسیو سونُے تہٕ سٹیٹ فیمنِزم چھُ تی پَکناوان برونٛہہ برونٛہہ.
This was all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. أسۍ کٔر کوٗشِش کہِ أسۍ کَرو ڈِسکس کینٛہہ elements of colonial feminism. یہِ چھُ اکھ vast subject. In the next podcast, کَرو أسۍ کَتھ about native informants extensively. Thank you so much for listening to us and give us your feedback on our Twitter page. Allah Hafiz.